China is rapidly becoming a dystopian society, to the likes of which we've only heard about in books such as 1984. But unlike 1984, this is a reality that all Chinese citizens are currently living in. And the CCP has used this authoritarian grip to drive its population toward its global goals. But the fact that China has achieved this without causing major political unrest is no accident. Through different strategies and policies, the Chinese government keeps holding on to power. So let us take a closer look at how China controls its population. You might have heard about China's social credit score system, but unlike the common perception, this is not a nationally instituted program. Instead, social credit score is implemented on a local scale. What this means is that individual cities, districts, or even large businesses can create their own modified versions of the system. But the overarching framework is to reward good behavior and to punish bad behavior. And if you look at the social credit score system on its surface, it might not seem so different from social and legal institutions that exist in the West. For example, if you commit a crime, you go to prison. If you're unproductive at work, you get fired. These are examples of how even Western countries program certain behavior into our citizens. But the difference is that China basically puts this normal system on steroids. If you happen to do or say anything that does not go well with the government, they are fully obligated to remove some of your social credit score. And if you reach a low enough score, your access to public transportation, work, education, or even medical care will get heavily restricted, meaning that most people simply choose to follow the government's agenda, since the consequences simply aren't worth it. But don't think that this only applies to political crime. Even just jaywalking is enough of a crime to justify lowering your score. And what allows this type of control is the next weapon in China's arsenal: mass surveillance. 400 million. That is the amount of surveillance cameras that China has. That is almost one camera for every 3 citizens. And not only does this enable the government to constantly monitor everyone, it also creates a sense of wherever you go, you are being watched. George Orwell described the use of this in his book 1984, where a totalitarian government uses mass surveillance in order to enforce fear into its population. That is why the biggest effect of CCTV is actually psychological, because citizens who are in constant fear of being watched are less likely to revolt or protest, for example. But in the end, they can't put security cameras in every single household, and that is where the third technique comes into play. In the Soviet Union and Nazi Germany, there was a specific culture that was purposefully indoctrinated into society, and this was informant culture. Informant culture is when the government encourages everyone to basically rat out each other, and if you choose not to tell the police about a crime you witnessed, you will be equally punished as the person you didn't inform on. And China has used the Soviet and German informant model in its own society, to the point that it even reaches all the way down to the household itself. Therefore, the CCP doesn't need to put security cameras or microphones in every house, because they practically already have that through informants. And of course, if you as a discontent citizen can't trust anybody, not even your own family, good luck trying to form any organized resistance. And this is exactly what the Chinese government wants. But in a society which clearly suppresses its people, you would think that everyone would be largely unhappy or purposeless. But in China, this is not the case. Through vigorous education and indoctrination from an early age, Chinese citizens are programmed for a certain purpose from the start. An example of this is the clear difference between Western and Chinese TikTok. In China, TikTok, or Douyin as it's known there, is filled with videos of educational, patriotic, and inspirational content.
In their version of TikTok, if you're under 14 years old, they show you science experiments you can do at home, museum exhibits, patriotism videos, and educational videos. And they also limit it to only 40 minutes per day. Now, they don't ship that version of TikTok to the rest of the world. So it's almost like they recognize that technology is influencing kids' development, and they make their domestic version a spinach version of TikTok, while they ship the opium version to the rest of the world.
Through this, they can give their young population a sense of determination and purpose, and therefore, the Chinese populace becomes more blind to the freedoms that they don't have. And like Joseph Stalin said, education is a weapon whose effect depends on who holds it in his hands and whom it is aimed at. With this said, it should come to no surprise that China alters its education to push a certain agenda, Historical topics that somehow can enforce a negative view of the Communist Party are simply ignored or even banned to cover in school. One example of this is the infamous Tiananmen Square massacre, where protesters were brutally gunned down for their attempt in spreading political reform. But clearly, the CCP doesn't want to share these events, so they are simply deleted from the history books completely. Another thing that they don't teach in Chinese schools is how infamous China is for oppressing different cultures, and this is part of their fifth strategy, which is cultural homogenization. Cultural homogenization is an incredibly effective tool, since it allows you to eradicate other cultures and enforce your own beliefs on them. And since China is an empire that stretches over 9 million square kilometers, it is a very diverse country. Although the problem with diversity, if you're an authoritarian government, is that other cultures might have different belief systems and, therefore, they pose a threat to your way of running things. That is why China has set up vocational education and training centers that are basically the modern equivalent of concentration camps. The most infamous of these exist in Xinjiang, where Chinese Muslims have to go through a re-education program. And by stripping away people's cultural identity, the CCP replaces it with whatever political beliefs they want its population to have. And if we look closely enough here, we can see the common pattern that exists in all of these tactics. You denigrate and destroy every sense of individualism and replace it with something different, like patriotism, purpose, or anything else the party desires. Through this, you can puppeteer your whole population like their dolls. And perhaps this is one of the main factors in China's rapid growth over the past 40 years. By unifying the whole nation toward one singular goal, China manages to compete with economical giants like the EU and US. But in the end, at what cost for the rest of the population? Every now and then we can see cracks in China's armor, like the 2019 Hong Kong protests. These indicate that the younger populace is becoming more and more discontent with the current restrictions on their freedom. So even though the CCP is effective in suppressing its population through the different means that I've mentioned today, the real question lies in how long it will take before it all collapses.